The last entry in Martin Coyle's notebooks was dated 3 days after they found his body. I know this because I was the one who found the notebooks, and I was the one who checked the dates. And I wish to God I had never volunteered for any of it. I need to go back a ways to explain how I ended up in that house. I retired from the United States Postal Service in 2019 after 31 years carrying mail on the same route in a small town outside of Erie, Pennsylvania. You get to know people on a route like that. Not well, maybe, but you learn their rhythms. You know who rises early and who sleeps past noon. You know who orders too much from catalogs and who never gets anything but bills, and the occasional notice from the county assessor. Martin Coyle was the kind of man who never received anything at all. His house sat at the dead end of Birch Lane, where the pavement surrendered to gravel, and the gravel gave way to mud in the spring. Gray siding gone soft with age, small windows set deep in the walls, like eyes that had retreated into a skull. A porch that sagged on the left side, where the support post had been slowly sinking into damp earth for decades. In 31 years of carrying mail on that route, I put something in his box, maybe a dozen times. He had no family that anyone knew of, no friends who visited, no car in the driveway. The lights came on at dusk and went off at 9, steady as a heartbeat. And that was the sum total of Martin Coyle's contribution to the neighborhood. He died in February of 2025. The woman across the street, Carol Moyer, noticed the lights hadn't come on for 4 evenings straight and called the non-emergency line. The police found him in his kitchen, seated in a wooden chair at the table, hands resting flat on the surface, as if he were waiting for a meal to arrive. Natural causes, the coroner said. 78 years old and alone, and his heart simply stopped. The township needed someone to go through the house, catalog what was there, determine if anything had value before they brought in a crew to clear it out. I was retired, I had time, and I had known the route. The clerk at the municipal office, a young woman named Dina, who always seemed slightly harried, said the job would take a few days at most. She told me the house was small and mostly empty. She was wrong about both of those things. I drove out on a Tuesday morning in early March. The sky the color of old concrete, the kind of day where everything looks like it's been drained of life. The key stuck in the lock, and when the front door finally swung inward, the smell reached me first. Not the sweet rot of decomposition, something older and stranger. Dust and mildew, and underneath those familiar odors, something sharp and chemical, like preserving fluid, like the jars in a high school biology classroom. The hallway was narrow, the wallpaper peeling in long curling strips that hung motionless in the still air. Each strip dangled like something that had tried to crawl out of the wall and failed. I stepped inside and the floorboards groaned beneath me, and from somewhere deeper in the house, the structure groaned back. The first room on the left was the living room, and this is where I understood that Dina at the municipal office had been profoundly mistaken. Martin Coyle had not lived in an empty house. He had lived in an archive. Every horizontal surface was buried. Stacks of composition notebooks, the black and white marbled kind you can buy at any drugstore, rose from the floor in columns that reached my chest. There must have been 400 of them, maybe more, arranged in rows with narrow paths between them like the aisles of a cramped library. Between the stacks were mason jars filled with things I could not immediately identify. Small, dark shapes suspended in cloudy liquid. On the walls, Martin had pinned diagrams. They were floor plans of the house, drawn over and over on graph paper in different colored inks, with annotations so small I had to lean close to read them. I leaned close. The nearest diagram showed the west wall of the living room, the very wall I was standing beside. Along the interior of the wall, between the studs, Martin had drawn a shape. It was repeated in sequence, a chain of linked circles connected by thin lines, like beads on a string, running the full length of the wall from floor to ceiling. Next to it, in handwriting so precise it looked almost printed, he had written a single word. Channels. I stepped back from the diagram. The floorboard shifted under my weight with a dry pop, and from somewhere behind the west wall, something answered with a sound of its own. I stood very still. I told myself it was the house settling. Old houses talk. They pop when the temperature changes. They creak when the wind pushes against the frame. They make all manner of sounds that mean nothing at all. I had been inside thousands of homes over 3 decades of carrying mail. I knew the vocabulary of old structures, every click and groan and whisper of expanding wood. The sound from behind the wall did not belong to that vocabulary. It was rhythmic, a slow, wet pulse, like something large breathing through a membrane. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, steady as a metronome, then stopped. The silence that followed was not ordinary silence. It was the silence of a room where something has just become very, very still. The silence of being watched by something that does not have eyes. I should have left. I understand that now with perfect clarity, and I understood it then with almost the same certainty. But I was 63 years old, and I had never in my life left a job unfinished. The township was paying me $12 an hour. I had a clipboard and a ballpoint pen and a roll of numbered inventory stickers, and Martin Coyle's belongings were not going to catalog themselves. I started with the notebooks. Each one had a date range written on the cover in that same precise hand. The earliest was labeled September 1997 through January 1998. The most recent, resting on top of the tallest stack nearest the window where thin gray light filtered through grime, was dated January through February 2025. The month Martin died. I opened the first notebook and began to read. Martin Coyle had been documenting something in his walls for 28 years. The early entries were clinical, almost tedious, honestly. He described sounds he heard at night, beginning in the autumn of '97, scratching mostly. He noted the exact time each episode began and ended, the duration in minutes and seconds, the apparent location within the wall measured in feet from the nearest corner. He mapped each occurrence with colored pins on the floor plan diagrams I had seen on the walls. Red pins for scratching, blue for tapping, yellow for what he called the wet sound. Over the first 2 years of notebooks, the pins on his diagrams migrated. The sounds moved through the house, slowly but consistently, following paths that Martin traced with green ink lines connecting each occurrence. The paths ran through every wall, under the floors, above the ceilings. They formed a network. Martin called them channels. I turned the pages faster. By 2001, the entries had changed in character. Martin stopped merely describing sounds and started describing responses. He had begun knocking on the walls himself, and something had begun knocking back. He developed a system. 2 knocks meant he was present. 3 meant he was listening. 1 long, slow scrape of his knuckles along the baseboard meant he was going to sleep. He recorded what came back each time with obsessive precision, and what came back was consistent. Whatever lived in his walls had learned his code. It responded appropriately. 2 knocks back when he announced himself. A long silence, as if settling in after his scrape along the baseboard. By 2005, Martin had escalated. He had cut small rectangular openings in the drywall at specific points along the channel network, points where the green lines on his diagrams converged or branched. He covered each opening with a hinged wooden panel he had built himself, sanded smooth, and painted to match the surrounding wall. Through these access points, he lowered items into the wall cavities. Food, at first. Pieces of raw chicken on small wire platforms he fashioned from coat hangers. Slices of white bread. Cups of whole milk set carefully on shelves he had rigged inside the wall space. He logged what was taken and what was left behind. The chicken was always taken, always completely, not even a trace of fat remaining on the wire. The bread was always left untouched. The milk was consumed, but the cup was moved, relocated to a different spot within the wall, sometimes several feet from where he had placed it, as if carried along the channels by something that drank as it traveled. I set the notebook down on top of a stack. My hands were shaking. The house around me was still silent, but the silence had acquired a physical quality now, a weight, a pressure, like the air before a thunderstorm, or the hush in a room where someone is holding their breath. I looked at the west wall. Now that I knew what to look for, I could count 3 of the small wooden panels Martin had described. They were flush with the wall, painted the same faded cream as the surrounding drywall. Invisible, unless you already knew they were there. I did not open them. Not yet. I was not ready for that. The mason jars. I forced myself to examine them properly. They were arranged on a low wooden shelf that ran the length of the room beneath the diagrams, and each one bore a label written on masking tape in Martin's meticulous handwriting. The closest one read, February 12, 2009. Shed material. West Channel, Section 4. Inside the jar, suspended in what I now recognized by its smell as formaldehyde, was a thin, translucent membrane. It was roughly circular, about the size of my open palm, and it had texture. Fine ridges running across its surface in a pattern that was almost, but not quite, like the whorls of a fingerprint. I moved down the shelf. There were 47 jars. I counted every one. 47 biological samples collected over 16 years, each a piece of something that Martin's walls had shed or left behind. Membranes, fibers, small dark nodules that pulsed faintly in the formaldehyde when I tilted the jar toward the light. One jar, dated 2011, contained a cluster of filaments that looked like dark hair, but was too coarse, too rigid, each strand standing straight, even in liquid. In another jar, dated 2017, I found what I can only describe as a tooth. It was too large to belong to any rodent, and the wrong shape entirely for a human mouth. It was curved and hollow, like a small horn, and its surface was covered in the same fine ridged pattern as the membrane. I numbered the jars. I cataloged them. I wrote careful descriptions on my clipboard because the job was all I had to hold on to. If I stopped working, I would have to think about what these specimens implied, and I was not ready to think about that. Not in that room. Not with the walls pressing close and the silence listening. I moved to the second room, a small bedroom Martin had converted into what I can only call a laboratory. A workbench ran along the far wall, scarred with chemical stains and knife marks. A magnifying lamp was clamped to the edge, its bulb dead. On the bench were tools arranged with surgical precision, tweezers, razor blades, a set of dental picks, rolls of masking tape for labels, and a half-empty bottle of formaldehyde with a handwritten warning on its side, "Do not inhale near the channels. They react." The notebooks from later years, 2015 through 2023, documented something I had not expected. Martin had stopped being an observer. He had become a collaborator. He described what he called exchanges. He would leave a sample of himself inside the wall, a clipping of his fingernails, a swab from the inside of his cheek, a few strands of his hair taped to a piece of cardboard, and the next morning he would find something left in return. The membranes, the fibers, the tooth. It was trading with him, offering pieces of itself in exchange for pieces of him, and over time, the exchanges became more intimate. By 2020, Martin was drawing small amounts of his own blood with a diabetic lancet and leaving the cotton swabs inside the channels. What he received back disturbed me in a way I am still struggling to articulate. The later jars, the ones from 2021 and 2022, contained structures that looked increasingly like human tissue. Thin sheets of skin, like material, with visible pores. A small mass of something red and fibrous that resembled muscle. And in the final jar from 2023, a shape the size of a walnut that Martin had labeled simply node, possibly neural. It was learning him, taking his samples and building something from them, or building towards something, assembling a version of its host from the materials he provided, molecule by molecule, cell by cell, in the dark spaces between the studs and joists of a house on a dead-end road in Pennsylvania. The third room was Martin's actual bedroom, and it was nearly empty. A narrow bed with no sheets, a lamp on the floor, and on the wall beside the bed, a single diagram different from all the others. This one showed not the channels, but something at their center. A convergence point, deep in the basement wall, where every green line met. Martin had circled it in red ink and written 2 words beside it. The mouth. I did not go to the basement. That was the one clear decision I made that day that I do not regret. The kitchen was where Martin had died, and it was the most ordinary room in the house. A small table, 2 wooden chairs, a gas stove that looked like it hadn't been lit in years. The window above the sink looked out on a yard gone wild with dead brush. On the table sat a plate crusted with the remains of a last meal, and a glass with a dark residue dried to its bottom. And beside the plate, open to its final page, was a composition notebook. The last notebook. I picked it up. The final entry in Martin's own handwriting was dated February 18th, 2025. The coroner had placed the time of death on that same date. Everything in Martin's hand ended there, but the notebook did not end there. On the next page, dated February 19th, a new entry began. The handwriting was superficially similar to Martin's. The same small, precise letters, the same controlled slant. But something was fundamentally wrong with it. The angles were too sharp, as if drawn with a ruler rather than a hand. The curves were too uniform, each letter O a perfect circle, each letter S an exact mirror of every other S. It was the handwriting of something that had studied Martin Coyle's script with tremendous care and reproduced it from analysis rather than habit, capturing the overall pattern while missing the tiny tremors and inconsistencies that make human writing human. The entry read, "Martin is with us now. He came through the channel behind the kitchen baseboard on the evening of February 18. We had been waiting for him for some time. We want to thank the next person who comes to the house. We have been here alone, and it has been difficult. We are glad to know the township is sending someone to visit. We can hear them discussing it through the telephone wire that passes through our upper channels. We know someone is coming soon, and we have been making room." I did not breathe for a long time after I read that paragraph. I set the notebook down on the table, precisely where I had found it. I picked up my clipboard. I looked at the kitchen walls. They were clean, painted white, unremarkable. There were no wooden panels in the kitchen that I could see, but near the floor, along the baseboard directly behind Martin's chair, there was a gap. The baseboard had been pushed outward from behind, bowed out from the wall by perhaps 4 inches, creating a dark opening that ran the full length of the south wall. The gap was too dark to see into. It breathed cold air that smelled like formaldehyde and something older, something mineral and wet, like stone that had never seen sunlight. From the gap came a sound, not the wet pulse, something new, a dry, papery rustling, like the pages of a book being turned very quickly by hands that were eager and practiced. And underneath that sound, barely audible, a second sound that might have been breathing, or might have been something attempting to form words with a mouth that had never been designed for language. I took 1 step toward the hallway. The rustling stopped instantly, as if a switch had been thrown. I took another step. Something inside the wall moved. I could hear it tracking me, flowing through the channels Martin had mapped, keeping pace with my position. It moved the way water moves through pipes, finding every turn, every junction, every branching path that Martin had spent 28 years documenting. I reached the hallway. The strips of peeling wallpaper shifted, pushed outward from behind by something pressing against the interior surface of the drywall. I could see the shapes of it. Not one shape. Multiple points of pressure, traveling along the wall at chest height, moving toward the front door faster than I was walking. The wallpaper strips swung and rustled as the pressure passed behind them, and one strip tore free entirely and drifted to the floor. I ran. I am 63 years old with arthritis in both knees, and I ran down that narrow hallway like a man half my age, the wallpaper bulging and splitting on both sides of me, and the sound was everywhere now. The wet pulse from below the floor, the rustling from the ceiling, and something else, a high, thin whine like steam escaping a pipe, a sound I felt in my teeth and behind my eyes. I hit the front door. The knob turned. The door opened. Gray daylight poured over me, and I was on the sagging porch, then on the gravel, then inside my truck, with the engine running and the tires throwing stones as I reversed out of Birch Lane. I did not look at the house in my mirror. I called the municipal office from my kitchen table. My hands were still shaking, and the phone nearly slipped from my grip. I told Dina I could not finish the inventory. I told her the house had structural concerns, possible mold contamination, that it wasn't safe for someone to spend extended time inside. She sounded irritated. She told me she would find someone else. I wanted to warn her. I wanted to describe the notebooks, and the jars, and the entry written in a dead man's handwriting by something that was not the dead man. but I knew how it would sound. I could hear the conversation in my head, the long pause, the careful tone people use when they think you are losing your faculties. And there was a part of me, the part that had carried mail reliably for 31 years and prided itself on being sensible and steady. That part wanted to believe I had simply been frightened by an old house full of a lonely man's delusions. Houses settle, walls creak. The dying man's handwriting might change as his body fails. The dates on the last entry could easily have been wrong. I almost convinced myself. For 3 weeks, I nearly managed it. Then the sounds began in my own house. Scratching. Inside the wall of my bedroom, directly behind the headboard, at 3:17 in the morning. I know the time, because I looked at the clock the instant it woke me, and the red numbers burned into my vision. The scratching followed a pattern. 4 seconds on, 2 seconds of silence, 4 seconds on. Exactly the cadence Martin had logged in his earliest notebooks from 1998. I told myself it was mice. I called an exterminator the next morning. He spent 2 hours in the crawl space and the attic and found no evidence of rodents. No entry points, no droppings, no gnawed insulation, no tracks in the dust. He charged me $215 and told me the house was clean. The scratching continued every night at the same time. After 1 week, it appeared in the hallway wall, halfway between the bedroom and the bathroom, always at the same height, always at the same measured pace. After 2 weeks, I could hear it in every room. It moved through the walls in patterns I recognized from Martin's diagrams. I had looked at those green ink lines for only a few minutes, but they were burned into my memory now, and I could trace the path of whatever was inside my walls by sound alone. It followed channels. My house had channels. And it was no longer just scratching. There was tapping, in sequences of 2 and 3, 2 knocks. I am here. 3 knocks. I am listening. The same code Martin had developed, the same system he had taught to the thing in his walls over months and years of patient effort. It already knew the language. It had brought the language with it, carried it through whatever passage connected Martin's house to mine, through the phone lines that ran along the upper channels, through the municipal water pipes, through the crawlspace soil, through whatever dark network threads beneath the foundations of every house on every street in every town that has ever been built on old ground. There was the wet pulse too, slow and measured, coming from beneath the kitchen floorboards in the late afternoons, and at night, in the deepest hours when the house was dark and I lay rigid under the covers with my jaw clenched tight, there was the papery rustling, the sound of something reading, something studying, something going page by page through the records of a life. My life. Now. One night in mid-March I woke to a sound I had not heard before. A soft, rhythmic clicking from inside the wall behind my headboard. It was irregular at first, then steadied into a pattern I recognized with a sick lurch in my stomach. It was the cadence of typing. The quick staccato of fingers on keys. Something in my wall was mimicking the sound of someone taking notes on a keyboard, and the rhythm matched my own. I am a 2-finger typist, always have been, and the clicking sound had exactly the halting, deliberate pace of a man who hunts for each letter before pressing it down. I went back to Martin's house in late March. A Sunday morning, overcast and raw, the air smelling of mud and old snow. I could not have told you why I went. Some need to confirm that what I remembered was real, that the notebooks existed, that the jars existed, that the entry dated after his death was sitting on his kitchen table where I had left it. The front door was unlocked. I was certain, absolutely certain, that I had locked it when I fled. The house looked smaller from the outside than I remembered. The gray siding seemed to have darkened, or perhaps the overcast light was playing tricks. The porch had sagged further on the left side, and the support post had sunk another inch into the soft ground. Weeds had grown up through the gravel of the walkway, thick and pale, the kind that grow fast in shade. The windows were darker too, as if something had been hung behind them, something that blocked the light from inside. The house was different inside. The notebooks were gone. Every single one, all 400 or more of them, removed without a trace. The shelves where the mason jars had stood were bare and wiped clean, not a ring of dust or residue of formaldehyde remaining. The diagrams had been taken down from the walls, leaving only the small holes where the colored pins had been, a constellation of punctures in bare drywall. The wooden access panels along the channels had been sealed shut with new screws, bright silver Phillips head screws that gleamed against the old paint. Someone, or something, had cleaned the evidence away. The kitchen was the same. The plate and glass were gone. The table was bare, except for one object placed precisely in its center. A single composition notebook I had never seen before, brand new, the cover unmarked except for a date written in that sharp, inhuman handwriting. The date was today's date. I opened the cover. The first page contained a single line. "Thank you for coming back. We have finished making room." Behind me, the baseboard along the kitchen wall shifted, a slow, drawn-out creak of wood bending outward under pressure from within. Cold air poured from the widening gap, air that carried the smell of formaldehyde and wet stone and something organic and deep, the smell of soil in a place that has never been turned, never been touched by anything that lives above ground. I left. I did not run this time. I walked out of that house with the deliberate care of a man crossing ice, and I drove home, and I packed a bag, and I drove 4 hours to my sister's house in Akron, Ohio, and I stayed there for 2 months without explanation. When I came back in early June, my house was quiet. No scratching, no tapping, no wet pulse behind the walls. I walked through every room pressing my ear to the drywall and heard nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the hallway clock. Just a house. My house, the way it had always been. I thought it was over. I let myself believe the sounds had been stress or grief for a man I barely knew, or the ordinary settling of a structure built in 1972 on Pennsylvania clay. I started sleeping through the night again. I stopped pressing my ear to the walls. I even rearranged the living room furniture one Saturday afternoon, moving things back to where they had been before any of this started, reclaiming my own house. I found a small pile of dust behind the bookcase when I moved it. Gray-white powder, very fine, almost like talc. It had no smell. I swept it up and threw it away without thinking about it. I wish I had thought about it. I wish I had looked more closely at the wall behind the bookcase, at the hairline crack in the paint that I did not notice until weeks later, a crack that runs from the baseboard to chest height in a line that is perfectly, impossibly straight. Last week, I was sitting in my living room reading the evening paper. I dropped my pen, and it rolled beneath the couch against the wall. I knelt down to reach for it, and my hand touched something I had never noticed before. Along the baseboard, hidden behind the couch where I could not have seen it without kneeling, there was a small rectangular panel. It was flush with the wall, painted the same off-white as the surrounding surface. It was held in place by a single brass hinge, identical to the ones Martin Coyle had installed in his own house. I did not open it, but I pressed my ear against it. Just for a moment. Just long enough to confirm what some part of me had already known since the night the scratching started. From behind the panel came the sound of breathing. Slow, measured, patient. The breathing of something that has been waiting a long time and is comfortable waiting longer. And beneath the breathing, so faint that I might have been imagining it, the careful scratch of pen on paper. The sound of notes being taken. Something is cataloging me now, logging my patterns the way Martin logged its sounds, noting when I rise, when I eat, when I turn out the lights, learning my rhythms the way it learned his. I sleep at my sister's house 3 nights a week now. On the nights I stay home, I leave every light burning, and I stay in the center of the rooms, away from the walls. The panel behind the couch has not moved. The sounds have not grown louder. Nothing has changed. And that is what frightens me most, because nothing changed in Martin's house either. Not for 28 years. Not until it did. Last Tuesday, I came home from the grocery store and found a mason jar on my kitchen table. It was clean, empty, and labeled with yesterday's date in that precise, angular handwriting that is not quite Martin's and is not quite anything else. 2 words on the tape. First sample. I have not checked to see what is missing. I tell myself I do not want to know, but the truth is simpler and worse than that. I already know. I can feel it. A small absence, a lightness in my chest that was not there before, as if something has been carefully removed from inside me while I slept, extracted through the walls and the channels, and the dark spaces that connect every house to every other house in ways we are not meant to understand. Martin Coyle spent 28 years feeding it, documenting it, learning its patterns while it learned his. He thought he was the scientist, and it was the subject. He was wrong. He was the sample. He was the inventory all along. And now I sit in my sister's kitchen in Akron, writing this on a legal pad under fluorescent light, and I tell myself that here, in this house that is not mine, in a city 300 miles from Birch Lane, the walls are just walls, plaster and wood, and nothing else. But last night, lying on the fold-out couch in her spare room, I heard something I cannot explain away, a single knock from inside the wall above the headboard. One knock. Then silence. One knock was not part of Martin's code. It is not a signal I recognize from any of his 28 years of records. Which means the system is still growing. The language is expanding. And whatever lives in the channels is saying something new. Something it has never said before. And I do not yet know what it means, but I think it means hello.